Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between object relation theory and Lacanian psychoanalysis. So even though both schools of thought are part of psychoanalysis, what you should know is that there's many differences, both in the clinical handling of the patients and on the metapsychological front, i.e. the theories behind the theories. So I'm going to do my best to try and lay out all the differences, but you should just know before we start that I'm by no means an expert in Lacanian thought, even though I've had teachers that were analyzed by him or worked with him. I myself would not call myself a Lacanian, nor would I call myself an expert. I'm more an educated individual in these topics, but I'm not the pinnacle of them, right? I am much more knowledgeable about object relations. Nevertheless, I know the differences, the main differences between both schools. Last thing I would like to preface this is that it's not a versus, like why object relations is, I don't know, better than Lacanianism, or how Lacanianism does in object relations. I don't believe in that. It's not a versus. This is they're different, and I'm going to explain the differences. Both schools have helped immensely understand the mind, and also clinically they've helped patients throughout the decades where they've existed. So this is not a battle or competition, all right? It's just what makes the two schools so different. Well, one of the first elements I'm going to start with is the clinical handling of patients. Lacanians have what they call in French discussion. So discussion is a breaking point in the session. For example, in object relations, we have sessions that are regular and that always or always-ish have the same time. For example, you don't shorten the sessions. For Lacanian schools, you can shorten the sessions if it has meaning. For example, I don't know, I'm going to give a fictitious example, but a patient will say something like, oh, I never could understand myself. I have the feeling that maybe there's something there. A Lacanian might stop at that point, even though it might only be 20 minutes into the session. That point stopping is there for the patient to keep in memory what he just said and to elaborate it outside of the session. It's like a castrating moment of like, no, you think about that, see you next time. So in these cases, in object relations theory, we don't believe in that. We feel that if there's something, an important point, we have to address it with the patient and help the patient elaborate on it. The Lacanians are far more castrated in this way that they will like cut off and say to the patient, now you think, and we'll talk about it next time. I also have to say that in this dynamic, sometimes, at least from what I've heard, some not so great clinicians use it to shorten the sessions or to really move on for the patient to move on. And at least on the outside, seems sometimes like an acting out. But the Lacanians would argue that the fact of having normal time sessions all the time is a sort of laziness of thought on the behalf of object relations, right? So, and that there is a risk for the patient to just turn and turn again on the same issues without developing new thinking. So these are disciplines in which we choose schools that are not necessarily, can't compromise on this. I should also end on this point that not all Lacanians do discussion, that cut-in, but some of them do. And it's always been a highly controversial topic. Even when I was studying, it was like some students felt this was a brilliant idea, other students thought it was terrible, as the price of the session does not change, right? You're still paying the same amount for 10 minutes as for an hour. So there's also that economic impact that we can't deny. So basically, that's also in the handling of the patients. Also, in terms of global thinking, Lacanians are very different from object relation theorists, as for Lacanians, there is no borderline nor narcissistic. So this might seem very bizarre, what I've just said, or schizoid, or any of the other personality disorders, because for Lacanians, there are only three structures: neurosis, with hysteria and obsessive and phobic, psychosis with schizophrenia, paranoia, and so on and so forth. And the third is perversion. So when discussing with Lacanians, they might disagree fundamentally on this idea that there is a borderline phenomena in patients. It's either they're neurotic or they're psychotic. They don't believe in halfway houses, so to speak. They also don't believe in organizational defenses, i.e., for example, let's say for a borderline patient, they've been abandoned by their parents or feel that they've been abandoned, therefore they build themselves in this fear of being re-abandoned again and again. The Lacanians don't believe that. Lacanians believe that, for example, someone with a borderline personality disorder is a psychotic. It's just that in their psychosis, they're able to manage it relatively well and not trigger psychosis perpetually. So the interpretation is quite different. For us, it's, for example, I would say for object theory, it's a relational issue. For Lacanians, it's a structural issue, i.e., constitutionally borderline, narcissistic, schizoid people are psychotic. So you might be wondering, yes, but there's so many other questions, like, for example, autism or ADHD. Lacanians have stayed with Lacan's thinking. Therefore, because these things were not prohibited at those points in time, they're not very much discussed by Lacanians. The only thing that Lacanians might have said on autism is that because they don't have use of language, they're not to be considered people as such. Very violent stuff. Also, when Lacanians, when they mean autism, they don't mean like high functioning. They always mean classic autism, right? It's just those little differences. So Lacanians have stayed not necessarily stuck as the clinician, the individual might be might know a lot of things, might be very thorough in his investigations and in his thoughts. So it's not like every single one of them stayed blocked, but the thinking of Lacan has stayed with Lacan, i.e. it's up to date until the 70s, 80s. And after that, it doesn't adapt to modern vocabulary. So basically, there we have it. We, Object Relations, believe in the relationship and defenses that are sometimes punctual or can be helped in order to alleviate the patient and freedom of their symptoms. And Lacanians believe in structure, i.e. you're a certain way ontologically and you don't get out of it. At the very, very best, it's just that your symptoms take up less space in your life. Which leads us to a second and important distinction between Object Relations and the Lacanians. So Object Relations, what's going to be central in the process of psychotherapy is this idea of transference and countertransference, i.e. the patient projects onto the therapist's stuff and the therapist absorbs that stuff and has a reaction, an emotional reaction and an emotional experience. We believe in Object Relations that emotional experience that we have in as clinician, for example, I feel tired with this patient, or I feel exhausted, or I feel excited, or I feel thrilled, or I feel this or that, says something about the relationship with the patient. What we believe is that element within ourselves says something about how the patient or experienced his relationships with others, or how others experienced their relationship with the patient. And that, for example, let's go for someone with abandonment issues. For example, if they make you feel anger and hatred, that might be the anger and hatred that the patient has felt when they were abandoned, when they felt powerless, or something else completely, like here I'm using a fake example, but you get the idea. Well, for Lacanians, that countertransference, they do believe in transference, but they do not believe in countertransference. They don't believe that it's useful, and they believe that this is more or less a projection of the therapist. So the point of Lacanians is that the analyst is a blank screen, right? Completely blank. You're not supposed to feel anything for the patient except for anxiety and boredom. That's it. All other feelings show a lack of analysis and a lack of deep work on the behalf of the therapist, i.e. you're not well analyzed enough. for the Lacanians if you feel anything else. And they say that in those moments you have to go back and see an analyst or a supervisor, because basically what you're doing is not being a widescreen, you're projecting onto the patient, i.e. both people are projecting, therefore the patient can never be freed from their symptoms. So this is a big, massive difference, because in object relations we do believe in the importance of countertransference and its necessity that the clinician has to be able to engage with it in order to be able to digest and understand the relations that the patient has with himself and with others, and be able to transform it to give it back to the patient. Lacanians don't feel that. They even feel that this is a almost fictitious, or dare I say delusional approach to therapy, because basically you don't know what's in, you can't engage with something that the patient hasn't officially said or projected. For them, this projective identification is in non-existent, and basically they dismiss it very, very thoroughly. And therefore, it's very complicated, because this leads to a lot of animosity between both groups. For example, I once said to my analyst, just to give you an example, that Lacanians did not use countertransference, yet they called themselves psychoanalysts. And he was like, yeah, well, in French he said, encore faudrait-il qu'ils soient des psychanalystes, meaning if ever, they would have to be considered psychoanalysts. And he didn't consider them psychoanalysts. That's to say how much tension there is between both schools. That it's not a calm, easy conversation. It's really a strong oppositional forces that so happen to be. And fundamentally, that question of countertransference seems to me, on my behalf, to be very, very useful, especially for people suffering from relational issues, that one cannot basically do without this idea of countertransference. The fact that the Lacanians do, for me, is a very dodgy way of doing it, because basically it's my theory on the Lacanians that they clinically are still touched by countertransference, and they still deepen their understanding through it, but they refuse that idea of it, saying that it's them and their, how can I say, and their story, which at certain times can be true, right? I'm not denying it, but to say that it's 100% true would also be wrong, and it would deny the fundamental aspects that very early childhood relations are co-built, and that's what they're kind of pushing away. So that's one of the big differences. Also, on a theoretical level, Lacanians do not believe in the true self. So it might seem very bizarre what I've just said, but what you have to understand is that for Lacanians, there is no such thing as a true self. At the end of ourselves, there is nothingness. So how does it work? For the Lacanians, basically we have a mask, a persona, and deeper down we have a second persona that we have towards ourselves. Like we have a play with others, but we also have a play internally with ourselves. So this runs completely against object relations, because in object relations, we do feel that there is of course, a form of interface, call it the persona, the false self, and so on and so forth. But deep down, there's a true self, something genuine that needs to be expressed, that needs to occur. For the Lacanians, nothing is there to occur. It's just what is inside after the mask is just another mask, and what is behind the second mask is this emptiness. And if we are to go too far, we will push the patient into feeling a despair because of nothingness. And that's the risk. Or even worse, technically speaking, we will push the patient to put on another mask, but a mask that we therapists want him to put on, i.e. the good and happy patient, which is a risk, I'm not going to deny it, but this idea that there is nothing of genuine in the human mind is kind of baffling to me. I said I was trying to be unbiased, and I really am, but that's how I think. I really find it strange as a preposition, but that's how the Lacanians think of it. On the behalf of object theory, what we believe is that patients make adaptations, but that adaptations do not necessarily show what they truly are. They do it because the environment is not good enough, or the environment might be hurtful, harmful, and destructive. Therefore, they have to adapt to it, and that adaptation creates a separation between what they truly are, who they truly are, and what they have to send to the world, the interface they have to show to the world. Therefore, it is of paramount importance for the patient to be able to reach their true selves and develop who they really are. So again, those true visions of the world are not really compatible with each other, because if you renounce the idea of a true self, then basically you are out basically to just make symptoms lesser, but not to find something deeper. Or if you try and find it, you have to be wary that it might lead to disastrous consequences. So it's a very pessimistic, when you really think about it, process. Also, the aim of therapy is quite different in both contexts. For object relations, the aim of therapy is to be able to create new healthy relations, both with the outside world and in oneself. Relations that will diminish the symptoms that are on display, like, for example, anxiety, depression, excess eating, and so on and so forth, right? For the Lacanians, that's not the aim. If you heal, that's even like an interesting and nice byproduct. That's not what it's aiming at. For the Lacanians, the aim of therapy is to understand that your desire is meaningless, that you don't really exist in the way you think you do, and lastly, that no one cares about you. Like in the fact that, like, if you disappeared tomorrow, there wouldn't be that much of a problem. And therefore people don't really desire you as you desire them. So it's a Lacanians, and I'm not saying all Lacanians do that or even believe that, but that's the Lacanian line, right, of thinking. Therefore, it's much more pessimistic, much more doubtful, and therapy is more like, and sometimes Lacanians will say that they're not even doing therapy, that's just something that just accidentally occurs in the process of seeking that. And the aim is, in a way, to live the best possible life without being yourself and being the less neurotic possible. So see, it's again, you can't make a compromise between both of those visions. So lastly, and most interestingly, training is very, very different, and differs often wildly. For object relations, as for most psychoanalysis, how it works is that you do your analysis with someone that's qualified in that school. You then go into psychoanalysis as trainee, and you train in that school of psychoanalysis. And lastly, you do a deductive psychoanalysis, i.e., an analysis in which the therapist, which is different from your previous one often, elaborates on why you want to become a psychoanalyst, and fundamentally opens the doors to examination from the institution, and the institution validates or not your apartments to psychoanalysis, or if you're ready. Lacanians do it very, very differently. Now, for them, first and foremost, the psychoanalyst isn't a title that is granted by someone else, but by yourself. So, in the French, he says, s'autoriser de soi-même, meaning to authorize yourself to become a psychoanalyst, which you might think is a bit weird, because it kind of is. Because by doing that, by offering that option, you're basically giving this idea that anyone can be a psychoanalyst, and it is a real risk, right, that anyone would claim that title afterwards. Now, because it's untrue to say that they don't have institutions, they do. They have institutions, they have what they call regulators, which we would call supervisors, and basically they have what is called the pass. The pass is one of those strange sins in which you, as a future analyst, will talk about not just why you want to be an analyst, but the very depth of what you've understood of yourself. And when I mean that, I don't mean that in a superficial way, like you'll go and talk about your deepest fantasies, your darkest wishes, and so on and so forth. Really the intimate stuff. And others will say, if you're ready or not, to be a psychoanalysis, but that doesn't mean they grant you the title. That's something you do by yourself. It's just if you want the in a way the recognition of others, you can do that. But it's very different. Also, and you have to understand this, the Lacanians often, like for example Zizek or Rodinesco in France, often despise the IPA, i.e. the International Psychoanalytic Association, because fundamentally they see them as having portrayed the spirit of psychoanalysis and just being mere bureaucrats and basically just paper pushers. They no longer respect the spirit of psychoanalysis. This harkens back to the fact that, and this is purely historical, basically Lacan wanted to gain control of the IPA, failed, and was kicked out of it. Therefore, he created his own alternative. Therefore, from the very get-go, both schools were always very separate, always very in competition, because fundamentally what Lacan wanted to do was integrate the IPA and basically subvert it, which did not happen, thank God. And you see that unbiasedness is not really doing it, right? But anyway, fundamentally both schools are so very different. So therefore, even though they both come under the umbrella of psychoanalysis, they fundamentally had a lot of oppositions, which is a shame because, to be honest, the average Lacanian is a very interesting analyst and will often have brilliant ideas. But those ideas sometimes push them to be over-intellectualizing, and they often reject other schools. And if you're saying, oh, I like that American analyst, God help you, because you're not supposed to say that, right? Because American psychoanalysis is seen as almost a perversion of true French psychoanalysis. So there's a lot of tension, as I was saying, in both parties. And fundamentally, and this is very important, in France, you're supposed to pick a lane. Or you're part of a school of object theory, like the Freudians, the psychosomaticians, and or integrative aspects of psychoanalysis, or you're a Lacanian. And often those are two schools don't mix. You can mix a lot of schools together. Even Jungian schools can be mixed with object relations. It doesn't cause that much of an issue. But Lacanian schools can't really be. So they're on their own, right? And that's why when I do, for example, a video on object relations, I don't include the Lacanian thought. Not because it's uninteresting, but because you're not really, they don't merge together. They're very strict, very divided, and there's a lot of internal fighting about everything, on everything of the spectrum, be it theory, be it clinical practice, be it the aims of therapy. So it's all to say that even though it's the same psychoanalysis, the inner fights are very, very important. And sometimes they're so important that people in object relations would be closer technically to CBT therapists than Lacanians. I'm speaking generally, of course. There's wonderful Lacanian individuals out there and wonderful Lacanian clinicians do nothing of that. But just to say that it's a very deep divide. And I wanted to talk about it because in France, that divide tool is very, very strong and very, very present. As I was saying in my speech, I tried to remain objective, but it's very hard because basically there's a lot of internal fighting. And I am by no means like a fully neutral individual. I picked my lane, and I think that sometimes it shows. But I'd rather be honest with you and still try and be objective with the Lacanians who brought a whole new way of thinking and whole new concepts which are incredibly interesting and I think have pushed psychoanalysis forward. It's just that sometimes we don't see eye to eye. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. If you have any comments, please feel free to put them down, even if you're Lacanian or you disagree, or no worries, I can handle that. Or even if you want to just ask a question. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.